This is our economic update. We do 2 or 3 of these a year, and just to provide a little bit of context on why and what we do. So this is a regional focused economic commentary. You'll hear and see lots of other commentary that comes out, Reserve Bank, Treasury, various different banks will do commentary on the national economy. This is not that. This is commentary on Christchurch and Canterbury and what's happening in our economy in the region. And look, there's a specific reason why we do this, which is what's happening in the economy here is not normal. So we have very high levels of change in our economy, and we have a very high level of stimulus out of the rebuild that is not normal. So what you'll see, and what we've shown over time previously, is that the shape of the curves around the economy in Canterbury don't look the same as they did before the earthquakes, and that's because of all the stimulus that is flying around. So what we try and focus on is, what does that mean? What's happening now? What's happening going forward? And what does that really mean into the longer term? And there are some pretty big changes that are now apparent where we're starting to do some thinking about what the next 15 years look like. So look, that's context for this session. We'll kick into it very shortly. Just a couple of other comments. Gee, isn't this a great location? It's the first time we've had the forum here. Was a little bit concerned about how the auditorium style would work. So it's a little bit more like a lecture as opposed to the cathedral where you can sit around the tables and be a bit more interactive. Please stay afterwards for a bit of a chat and mingle. There'll be a light breakfast served and more tea and coffee. So if you have the opportunity, stop and have a bit of a chat. We're really keen to keep the interaction and the discussion going out of these sessions. And the auditorium structure won't necessarily help that in the presentation, but hopefully you can hang around for a little bit and talk afterwards. Okay, let's get into it. Christchurch and Canterbury's economy are in a transition. It's a fairly trite phase. What does transition mean? Transition means that the level of growth and stimulus that the rebuild was giving us is now plateauing. And what that means is the mix in our economy is continuing to change, and it's now starting to head back to those more traditional sectors and opportunities for growth in Christchurch and Canterbury. So we will talk a little bit about rebuild emphasis, but we will focus more on what is happening in the underlying economy and what are the key trends that we need to be aware of and what are the opportunities for us to lever. So, really, really high levels of output, record high levels of output, consistently very high. The challenge with that is that growth rates are now very low. Do not let anyone make negative comments about the Christchurch or Canterbury economy, because it's really easy to run a headline that says low growth, economy stagnating, because the traditional measure is your percentage of GDP growth rate. The reality is we've got a plateau of incredibly high levels of activity and a high base, which means our percentage growth rates quarter on quarter look low. But the reality of the size of the economy in Christchurch and Canterbury is it has never been as big as it is today. So you hear lots of commentaries and statements about where are we in the rebuild and we're X through. This is a chart that MB and CDC have worked on together for 3 years, and it kind of 4 years actually. It highlights where we're through in the major work programs. Actually, if you run up from December 16, you can see we're sitting up here. So it's more than halfway through, but nowhere near complete. Still a very large program to go. What you will see is that from now on, basically, the cumulative total spend in the rebuild drops on a quarter-by-quarter basis. So what is happening is the amount of money that the rebuild has been pumping into the economy is now at a very high level, but starting to decline. That decline will continue. It will be consistent. The great news is it's not a sharp and rapid decline. It happens over a number of years, out to 2021, and is relatively gradual. That's important because it gives us a chance to adjust back into our core key sectors. It gives the labour market time to adjust. It gives us an opportunity to work through where we want to head over the next 15 years. So there's been lots of commentary nationally around tourism, and we are having, as a nation, an incredible boom in the visitor sector. I've put this up regionally because it's important to put the national context in here. So you can see now that we have international visitor numbers and domestic visitor numbers that are consistently growing. Relatively modest growth, but good consistent growth. And back up from the troughs immediately post the earthquake. Still not, I've got to say, back at 2009 and 2010 levels. So on its own, that looks okay. But when you put it into the national context of the total growth in visitors, and in particular the total growth in tourists, we are missing a major opportunity in that space. Now there are some specific reasons for that, in particular hotel and bed nights in the city. But what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years is the world and the rest of New Zealand has adjusted to Christchurch not having physical infrastructure in the city. And there's now routes and pathways and packages that avoid the city. So we're going to have to do something about just building hotels on its own will not be enough for us to recapture the visitor share that we want in the city. We are going to have to think about what are the compelling propositions that enable us to reclaim our rightful space with the market. Now there is some good news, which is this is what happened to hotel room capacity in the city immediately after the earthquake. So you can see we lost an awful lot of capacity. There's been quite good growth back up, but from a very, very low base to today. That is what it looks like over the next 3 to 4 years. So that is builds that are already consented or coming out of the ground or have been announced as committed plans. So there's really high growth in hotel rooms coming in the city. Unfortunately, that still doesn't quite get us back to the number of rooms that we had prior to the earthquakes. So when you look at that growth curve on its own, you think, gee, that's a significant challenge just to achieve that. There's a lot of room for that to slow down, and that pace still won't quite be enough to get us back to the number of rooms that we had previously. So we do have a lot of work in the visitor space to do around how can we drive that capacity and how can we drive that sector size. Labour market. Again, there's the ability for a little bit of negative commentary nationally around Christchurch's growth rates. So I just want to highlight some things. We have 3.9% unemployment, so 4% broadly. We have a labour market participation rate, which is at 72%. So labour market participation rates don't move from 69% in Western world economies, or very rarely. Christchurch now, we've been way above 69% for 3 years. In effect, what that means, we have very close to zero unemployment. We have more people in the workforce than would normally be in the workforce, and we have very low levels of unemployment. And that situation has been ongoing for some time. It's just a phenomenal commentary on the employment opportunity that has existed and continues to exist in the region. We're very lucky to have those conditions. I'll talk about it a little bit more, especially when you consider some of the global situations out there which are nowhere near as attractive or compelling as Christchurch. And the other one that's here that's interesting, and has been this way for a while now, is that the difficulty in finding skilled labour remains below the national average. Now, that wasn't the case prior to the earthquake, and we didn't think it would be the case after the earthquake. We thought Christchurch would continue to find it difficult to get the skilled labour that it was looking for into its workforce. There's one particular reason why that number is lower, and that's been the successive migration into the city. So the ability to bring in qualified, skilled international migrants into gaps in the workforce that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to fill. So this is not taking jobs away from the local community or populace. This is finding skills that we couldn't get in the international marketplace. And in this, the earthquake really has had a major silver lining in that it put Christchurch on the map, and it made us more attractive to a percentage of the international population. So there are a group of people out there that are attracted to the concept of moving to a rebuilding city, of seeing something new happening, of seeing a new Christchurch emerge out of the ground. So those very high levels of international migration really have been an incredible positive for the economy, in particular in this skilled workforce space. I'll talk a little bit more about what it's doing to the diversity of the city in a little bit. Again, another significant positive. So, unemployment rates, national levels, Christchurch and Canterbury, we will trend back over time to the national level for unemployment. So if you look back to prior to the earthquake, you can see that the Christchurch and Canterbury economy, given its size you would expect this, is really closely correlated to the national economy. So our unemployment rates historically have run at roughly the national averages. We expect that to happen again. Where they separated here, and where we have sat well below the national averages for some time now, that's the rebuild impact. That's the impact of the construction market, the demand for labour in that space, and it's soaking up unemployment. Again, as the rebuild firstly slows and then begins to decline, that will ease. We will see some volatility in our unemployment numbers, in particular as the rebuild workforce transitions from phase to phase. We may see the odd spike per quarter, but basically over time, we will trend back to the national averages. Just want to highlight really how lucky we are in the region, because I don't think we potentially spend enough time thinking about it. So take the ultimate end of the scale, Greece, Spain, countries like that, very, very high levels of unemployment. Let's not use them as a comparator for us. Let's look at places like France and Ireland, 10%, 8% unemployment, roughly twice the levels that New Zealand has. Go down and think of an economy that everybody thinks of as strong and successful. Germany, at roughly the same unemployment rate as New Zealand, still a higher unemployment rate than Christchurch and Canterbury. So we have this incredibly fortunate set of circumstances that's been created by the rebuild that's enabled us to put people back into the workforce. And just the other comment that I would make is the brilliant thing about a construction rebuild is it's predominantly a blue-collar workforce. So it actually gives you an opportunity to put some of your lower socioeconomic demographic back into the workforce, train them, and have them ideally stay in the workforce moving forward. So we really have had an incredible opportunity out of that construction rebuild. Okay, housing market. Lots of commentary coming out around New Zealand at the moment about the New Zealand housing market, and some signs that it is plateauing, some signs that some of the pressure is coming off in Auckland a little bit, and actually some signs that some of the mechanisms that the Reserve Bank have been putting in place are starting to have an impact. So first set of restrictions basically push the demand out of Auckland and down into Tauranga and Hamilton, and then down into Wellington. Some signs now that is starting to ease. Christchurch and Canterbury is different. It hasn't seen the same level of equity growth rates in the housing market, and there's a really specific reason for that. For any of you that have been coming to these sessions, it was nearly 3 years ago we talked about what was going to happen in the housing market because of the amount of properties that we were going to build. That's what's keeping the lid on prices in Canterbury, is that we have been building significant levels of new stock in the housing market. And we continue to build significant levels of new stock in the housing market. So we will overbuild compared to the housing stock that we had prior to the earthquake. There's a specific reason why we've seen relatively modest but consistent growth rather than declining prices, which potentially we could have seen. And that's because we're enjoying some population growth. We've had migration into the city. So we've actually had slightly higher levels of demand into the long term than we would have had pre-quake. So what you're seeing is a more consistent, and I would say a more sustainable housing market in Christchurch and Canterbury than you are seeing around the rest of the country. And I think there is less risk of a housing shock here than there is, for example, in the upper part of the North Island, where you've had very high levels of speculation and equity growth that don't look sustainable, bluntly. So the housing market here is stabilising. We'll continue to see significant numbers of new properties come online. We really want to see those continuing levels of migration to soak those up. If we were to start to see signs of a population decline, then we would risk perhaps a little bit of a softening of the housing market. Don't think we're going to see that at the moment. I think we're going to see what we've seen a little bit more of recently, which is consistent but low levels of growth. Rental market. Actually seeing some really good trends that we were hoping we would see in this space. So rents are falling, and that's a good thing because they got too high. Rents are falling for two reasons. The first reason is that there's increased supply coming online. So those houses I was talking about us building in the equity market, that's even more true in the rental market. So we've had significant replacement of housing stock in the rental space. Now, what happened immediately post the earthquake? We lost a lot of that housing stock. There was huge demand for it, so that drove prices up. We're now seeing a reversal of that trend and actually seeing us head back to our traditional level of rents being just slightly below the national average. The other change in the rental market trend is that the huge demand for rental market from the construction sector as the rebuild cranked up has been satisfied, and actually now will gradually begin to decline. So we expect to see ongoing continuation of the trend in the rental market. We think we'll see slow decline in rents. Interestingly, that won't be across the board. So what you're seeing now is the emergence of a normal market in Christchurch. So that's driven by people's demand. Whereas the peak of the market after the earthquake, any house was a good house. Now there are multiple choices, so people are able to determine where they want to live. And in particular, if you're in an outlying area where you've got a long commute or you've got traffic congestion issues, we are seeing demand drop in those areas faster than it is in other areas. And again, that's exactly what you would expect to see. Okay, this next one is not well understood. And in particular, it's not well understood in Wellington and Auckland, and we need to do a little something about that. So everybody in Wellington still thinks that Christchurch has lost a lot of people after the earthquake. And the reality is the population of Greater Christchurch is now roughly 30,000 people and 20,000 people above what it was prior to the earthquakes. And the population of the city has recovered to pre-earthquake levels. The population of Canterbury is now at roughly 600,000 people. So there's been population growth across all parts of the region. And again, this is not well understood. There's still a perception outside of the region that people left after the earthquakes and didn't come back. And they don't understand that most people that left the city actually moved to Greater Christchurch, and that trend has really significantly reversed. Again, this is some messaging that we can probably do better nationally. We do expect that trend to continue. Okay. Last time I did this, I said this was my new favourite graph. It's still my new favourite graph, and we've done a little bit of extra work on it. So last economic update, I talked about the growing diversity in the city, in particular amongst the young, and focused on that 0 to 5 year age group and the fact that you only needed to go to Margaret Mayhew Playground to understand the diversity that had come into our community. What we've done now is we've modelled that out for what it will look like in the next 15 years. And actually it's startling. So we will have 40% of the population under the age of 20 that will identify as non-European. Now that's a very different Christchurch from the conservative face of Christchurch immediately prior to the earthquakes, but it means some things. They will want different amenity. They will want different services. They will want to do things slightly differently. And as a city, we are going to need to adjust to that. That will happen. This is basically a straight extrapolation out of the population that are here today as they age. So this is not running a massive optimistic set of ongoing or growing levels of migration. This is taking what we have today and extrapolating it forward. So this is going to continue to become a more diverse city. It's a really good thing. And this is just removing the details. So what you can see is children, the parents, and even in this sector in here, growing level of retirees that identify as non-European. Okay, where's that coming from? So I talked a little bit at the start about us wanting to not get into national picture, but understand what we look like in a region. We wanted to understand what the profile of the migrants was that was moving into the city and into the region compared to nationally. There's a really interesting trend in this. This is the first time we've done this piece of work, which is if you look at the 30-plus sector, what you can see is that the rest of New Zealand and the rest of Canterbury have a higher percentage of their migrants that are in an older age bracket. And that those people tend to bring their children with them. That is almost certainly, in Auckland's case, a commentary on the housing market in Auckland, because those are the people that would tend to come to buy a property, to live, to have their children go to school. So what is emerging is an older bracket that is more focused in the regions. The 20 to 30 age bracket, look, there's quite clear separation between Auckland and Christchurch and the rest. And you would expect this. Wellington is there, but not quite at the same level. And again, you would expect that because as a capital city, it has a slightly different economy to more traditional growth engine cities. But what you can see is that Auckland and Christchurch are clearly separating themselves as the first choice for young people that are moving to New Zealand. I'm not sure Christchurch would have been there if we hadn't had the earthquakes. So what is happening is that the rebuild opportunity and the regeneration opportunity is making us a viable choice for those young international migrants that are looking around at where they want to live in the world. Now, the reality of those people is they have a lot of choice. So the fact that we have a really high percentage within that age group is a comment on the proposition that Christchurch has to offer. And again, we need to do a little bit of work about telling the world that in a slightly more cohesive way. So the whole concept of a consistent city image, a structure and a story of what is going on here that continues to drive that trend is going to be critical going forward. Okay, can't talk about the city without talking about the region, because the two are fundamentally linked, have been for the last 200 years, will be for the next 200 years. But there is this weird bit in the middle where we've had an earthquake and we've got to rebuild the city, so the city has some different issues to the region. Canterbury as a region, in particular around agriculture, has had a couple of pretty tough years. Prices have been down, there's been drought in North Canterbury, it's been a tough time. Normally as a city, we would have been in a recession. Yeah, so when the region is down, the city tends to be down. The only reason we haven't been has been because of the regeneration stimulus. So we've actually got a bit of a lucky break economically out of the rebuild stimulus. We've had two of those in the last 5 years. The first one was when the earthquake first hit, we were insulated by a rural economy that was going absolutely gangbusters. Dairy prices were high, farmers were spending, there was infrastructure spend across the region, and it helped insulate the city from the worst impacts of the earthquake. So we've had a couple of pieces of good fortune in the last 5 years. This most recent one we probably haven't felt, but trust me, if we hadn't had the regeneration impact, we would absolutely have felt more what was going on out in the regions. There are some very good signs around global commodity prices. there has also been a lot more diversification of product out in the regions than people are necessarily aware of. So it is not all about dairy now. We think that's a really good trend. We think that's a trend that is going to continue. So you are seeing more niche crops, more niche products, more value-added capacity going into the rural regions, and that's a significant opportunity both for the city and the region going forward. Will continue to be that way. Talked a little bit about our core sectors. So manufacturing is probably the largest single sector in the Christchurch economy. It's a traditional sector. It's one that doesn't get all of the profile that some of the other bright and shiny ones do, but it's an incredibly important sector for our employment. And going forward, even more so. Because you want to talk about growth and population growth in the region, the only way for that to happen is for there to be employment opportunities. I'll talk about that again a little bit at the end. But manufacturing will be one of the key drivers of those. And there's some really good news in here, which is that consistently now, the manufacturing sector has been in an expansion, and actually been in expansion since the earthquake. So we know some of that is down to rebuild, but not all of it. So we've got a very important traditional sector in the economy that is doing exactly what we need it to, which is grow. Same, even more so with services. So services actually it's a funny sector in terms of what statistics do. So there are an awful lot of things grouped into services, including ICT, including consulting, a whole bunch of things. But incredibly strong growth now for some period of time. This broadly matches New Zealand, but just indicates another core sector of the economy where there is large long-term growth and what would look like significant employment opportunities going forward. Okay. Always get a bit nervous when I put this slide up. So we've been doing this for long enough now to get comfortable with the fact that we think we can make some predictions. So we've been doing these for a couple of economic updates now. So 0.9% GDP growth in the last quarter. Like I said, that looks low, but that shouldn't be a surprise, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. We think in a year's time that'll be down to about 0.5. We could well see GDP growth at 0. We may even see it slightly negative over different quarters. As long as that doesn't get too large and negative, I don't think anybody should be concerned about that. That overall size of the economy is still the largest it's ever been. Net migration, migration is just such a huge success story. We've been expecting it to slow down for a year. So 2016 third quarter, 1,800 people. 2017 quarter 3, we are predicting it will come back a little and still be 1,200 people. That's still nearly 5,000 people a year net moving into the region. That is still at massively record levels compared to the period before the earthquake. There will need to be employment opportunities. So the bit I haven't talked about nationally that will have some impact on this is, I don't know if anybody is aware, but the government just very quietly tightened the immigration requirements at a national level. And they did that for a specific reason, because there is growing demand internationally to move to New Zealand. And there are some big global trends that are driving that. There are some people out of Europe that aren't comfortable with what's happening in Europe, so we're seeing increasing demand from Europe. We're seeing increasing demand from the US. It might have something to do with the election that's going on right now. The reality is that right now New Zealand looks incredibly attractive to the world. We've got very low levels of unemployment. We're safe, we're secure, we're stable, we've got great schooling, we've got an economy that is in better shape than most of the rest of the world. We cannot have unconstrained migration. Our economy isn't big enough to support it. And that's especially true in Christchurch and Canterbury. Actually, what we wouldn't want to do is bring in people and find that there was no work for them, because that would start to create a social strain that actually to date we've managed really well. So the tweaking of the migration legislation has just made it slightly harder for the world to move to New Zealand. I don't think it will change the demand profile, and hopefully it won't change our ability to continue to attract highly skilled people into the region. But it is a commentary on how the world is viewing New Zealand. Okay, we think unemployment will rise a little bit, from nearly 4% to 4.5%, and heading towards the national average. And we do expect some volatility in that series. So let me explain. If a bunch of the rebuild workforce come out of the residential part of the rebuild, which we expect they will do over the next couple of years, they are not necessarily able to transfer into the rest of the economy. So we may see some of them shift out and other people come into other growth areas. So we will see a little bit of volatility in these series. What's a given is that over time we will head back to the national average. And finally, so this is just to highlight the amount of stimulus that is in the economy. $1.2 billion a quarter at the moment. In a year's time, still $1.1 billion. So no, it's not rising anymore. Actually, it's falling by $100 million a quarter, which sounds like a lot. But we have $1.1 billion a quarter still in our economy in a year's time. That's just an extraordinary stimulus that is giving us all kinds of benefits. Okay. Questions and discussions. Just before we get to that, what I would like to say is please stay afterwards for a bit of a chat with anybody, bounce any of the stuff around. There's a whole heap of information from CDC. I see a lot of you have got it already, but feel free to grab any of that, and please feel free to stay for breakfast and a coffee. Now, any questions? Steve?
You touched on it just in your last slide. We've had a tailwind from rebuild activities, mainly obviously a lot of construction and other things. How confident are you that the rate of growth that we'll see over the next few years will absorb the capacity that will be freed up from the assets down?
It's a great question. So first of all, lots of people predicted in the beginning that the construction workers would come, they would do their job, and they would bugger off. So they'd be in and out. Actually, the feedback from the workers that have moved to Christchurch is exactly the opposite. So they really like it here. In a lot of cases, they've brought their partners, they've brought their children, they're in the school system. They want to stay. So this group of people have been really well surveyed. 75–80% of them want to stay in the region, so long as the job opportunities are here. So what it really comes down to is the importance of those key sectors. Because if the employment opportunities are here, what is really clear is that the workforce wants to stay. So if we can keep the growth in the underlying sectors, if tourism and the visitor sector can continue to grow, if manufacturing, services, ICT, health, if those areas can continue to position themselves well internationally, then we will transition that workforce into the rest of the economy.
What do you see of the impact of increasingly rural irrigation schemes, like water, for example, as it comes on stage 1's online, stage 2's we're not far from construction?
So water gives you different optionality. So having regular, consistent supply of water to go into areas that don't have it enables you to do different things with that land than you would have been able to otherwise. The nutrient management legislation that is in place is very clearly going to have an impact on what some of those choices are. But look, internationally, we see a massive opportunity around niche products on the plains of Canterbury. So, we do basic soft commodity really well. We catch colds from it really well. We've done it at least 4 or 5 times in the last 100 years. It would be really great to see that economy evolve into a little bit more of a higher value add situation. Water does give us that opportunity.
Tom, with regard to visitor numbers, I see we're missing out on cruise ship passengers. There's an ongoing saga going on there with the port company and City Holdings. Can you see it being resolved? Because they're a very important visitor sector for Christchurch. I look at the growth of Auckland and Wellington. We're just missing out on it.
Yeah, we are missing it at the moment. So cruise goes into Akaroa. That will only take a particular type of boat. To capture the rest of the cruise market, there's a need for a terminal at the port. Look, that's a decision for CCHL and LPC. So there's a commercial decision for LPC, and then I guess there's a citywide decision for the city around how does it value cruise passengers, and is it prepared to ensure that a terminal gets built. There's no question that a cruise terminal would increase the number of visitors into the city. Well, Glenn.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for another great presentation. Just with regard to the housing there, and while it looks promising, what about for our migrant communities in terms of the quality of their housing and also the rental levels for them? Have you got some info on that?
Yeah, it's another good question, Glenn. So although rents have come off their record lows, we do still have an affordability issue in Christchurch around housing, and in particular for the lower socioeconomic demographic. It's not as bad as it is, for example, in Auckland, where I will tell you there is an unsustainable problem right now. But there is an issue in Christchurch, and in particular, when we lost our housing stock in the earthquake, we lost a lot of the lower equity value housing stock that enabled cheaper rental prices. So we've replaced that with modern new builds, but they have a higher capital value, and at the moment they have a higher rental value. So Glenn, I think you did right. I think there's an ongoing issue around affordability of housing for a percentage of the population here, and we do need to consider what the solutions are for that. Steve.
Just to comment on the cruise berth or the cruise terminal comment before. Actually, you don't need a cruise terminal. I've been on a dozen cruises and been 40 or 50 ports around the world. And the first thing that the tourists do when the boat ties up is they go across the berth or across to the buses and go to the rest of the city and enjoy the rest of the city. So building a cruise terminal would be a waste of money because people would just go straight past it. And so all we need is a berth to tie the ship up to, and then you're off and running.
Makes sense to me.
Thank you. I want to just go back and ask another question with regard to migration in relation to the construction sector. Start to see a lot of companies out of Auckland advertising for staff here in Christchurch, and as you've shown by your graphs, certainly in the residential sector, that's going to continue to fall away for quite some time yet. How's that going to impact worker numbers?
That's a great question. So we are now in a competitive marketplace for the labour in the construction industry. No question of that. There's going to be insatiable demand for construction out of Auckland, and we're going to need to be very careful about how we control that workforce. Look, the feedback from the sector themselves is so incredibly positive about the city and so clear about the fact that they want to stay. So long as we've got the work opportunities, we're relaxed about them choosing the city, but it's that having those work opportunities that's key. Caroline, then Tom.
Tom, you talked about earlier the lack of attraction of housing on the edge of the city and in outlying areas. And your graph showed the increasing diversity of the city, but also an ageing population. Do you have any thoughts or commentary on the type of housing that we're building and what we might need to do in the future?
I'm not a building expert, so no. But I would say that, in particular for the international community, inner city apartment/townhouse development is going to be critical. That's not necessarily true of your traditional Christchurch and Canterbury residents. So the apartment/townhouse market for the existing population in the city, their indication is they're not that interested in that. It's a relatively small percentage of the population that wants that. But that's not true of the international migrants. And so I talked a little bit around the changing demographic and the changing diversity of the city. That's a really good example. Those groups are particularly used to living in higher density accommodation in inner cities with an awful lot of amenity around them, and they will be looking for that as a solution. Tom?
Yeah, it's a similar related question, Tom. There's talk of 20,000 things people filling out the central city. But it's going to be very hard to get people to actually commit to that, to actually know who their neighbours are going to be. And then once they know their neighbours are going to be, are they going to be young university students partying from 10 to 2 o'clock in the morning, or are they going to be people like my good friend Dave here who's going to move when he retires into the central city? You're not going to have both.
I'm going to take a slightly different view. You can have both. You've just got to have a really good planning process to work out the how. So I love the idea of students being in the central city, being around Ireland. They bring a bunch of diversity and vibrancy into a community. It's about planning. So it's about the planning of the central city and how we get that right. Look, that sits very firmly with Regenerate Christchurch. But I see that as a solution coming fairly quickly.
My name is Gail from Max Contracts, and we are involved in recruitment of very many workers within New Zealand. And the interesting statistic that we've observed is that even though the numbers for workers are significant, the earning capability has dropped. The wages that drew people initially after the earthquake, which was quite high compared to what it is now, is considerably lower, making Christchurch less favourable from an earning perspective to what Auckland is offering at this point. We've also observed that companies that are luring workers to Auckland are offering things like accommodation and all kinds of other benefits, which not necessarily Christchurch employers are doing. So we need to be very mindful that as our population increases and as the people desire to come to Canterbury, we still have to have a value proposition for those young people to keep them here. And unfortunately, history has never changed when it comes to earnings. Younger people in the demographic that we need are drawn to having better earnings and giving themselves more of life's pleasures. Can Canterbury sustain that? Can it offer young people that going forward, knowing that Auckland has so much more allure when it comes to money?
It's a great point, but it isn't all about, so I think the difference here is it isn't all about money. So I'll give you a couple of statistics. So the percentage of total disposable income that goes on debt servicing for households in Auckland is 42%. In Christchurch it's 25%. So you are absolutely right. We have a lower income economy than Auckland. We have a significantly lower cost base than Auckland as well. We also have a better proposition around quality of life. But the point that you raised brilliantly, and I think you're absolutely right, is we have to make our case around that. It's not enough just to assume that everybody will get how awesome Christchurch is and want to come and live here. We have to be clear about, look, this is your earning potential. This is your cost base. This is the amenity that you have around you. This is things like the bike park, the beaches, the whole portfolio that goes into enabling them to make that decision. So actually, the feedback of the young people that are moving to Christchurch is phenomenal. They love it here. They're engaged, they love what's happening in the city, they're enjoying their community. It's extraordinarily positive. The difficulty is getting them to make the choice to come here, compared not just to Auckland, but to Sydney, to Melbourne, to Singapore, to London, because these kids have all of those choices. So we have to do a better job of making that pitch so we get more of them, because I think you did right. It's very easy to say, come and earn the big bucks. It's much harder to say, no, think about the whole picture. Think about your earnings versus your cost base versus your quality of life versus your ability to do things. And that's where our compelling proposition sits.
We've seen quite a lot of slightly worrying talk about us versus Auckland, and us competing with Auckland. What do you think about the tension about domestic migration and domestic attraction of business investment versus a much bigger opportunity, which is the 5 or 6 billion population of the global economy?
So we don't compete with Auckland, we should be collaborating with Auckland for exactly the reasons that you outlined. So we talk with the guys at ATED very closely. Brett O'Reilly and I catch up on a regular basis. Christchurch and Auckland should be presenting themselves to the world as a package that enables choice in New Zealand. There may well be businesses that look to move out of Auckland because of the cost base and different choices. Christchurch may be an opportunity around that, but the big picture, completely agree. The big picture is the global picture, and New Zealand and Christchurch and Auckland, which are clearly, from that chart, the two first choice propositions, we need to be on the same page and we need to be pitching people together. That is something we will do going forward. Yeah.
As we've all watched what's happening in the US with Clinton and Trump, has the city taken on any of the underlying reasons why that is happening and acknowledge the fact that change and diversity require an awful lot of buy-in from people there, or we're going to end up with disenfranchised us in the future if it's not managed, and education and all of those other things to avoid that sort of conflict.
Look, I think you raise a really, really good point. I think at a national level, the immigration tightening is a little bit of a first response to the rest of the situation around the world. But Christchurch actually has some thinking to do in this space, and that is our population is going to change. It's going to be more diverse. We are going to need to be more open to that. We are going to have to consider the changes and what we need to do to adjust and adapt. Look, what I will say is there's actually really good visibility of that in the city, and more than that, the city broadly has embraced diversity. So you haven't seen the xenophobic, radical responses to migration in Christchurch that, for example, you see in the deep south of the US or the Rust Belt. So the population has actually embraced it. But I think you raise a really good point. We need to do more than embrace it. There need to be some conscious programs about how we fully integrate the city into a more diverse future, and that's going to take some time and be quite complex. Laura.
You were talking about, I find it quite interesting how our labour force participation rate is at 72%, which is like 3 percentage points higher than elsewhere in the world and elsewhere in New Zealand. Have you done some modelling to sort of see if that has to do with our changing demographics, or is it all about just having more jobs available? Like, if there are more younger people who generally tend to work more or be more available for jobs?
No, so we haven't done any detailed modelling. We have had a little bit of a high-level look at it. The answer is it's a little bit of all of the above. So it's a comment on the opportunity and demand in the workforce. We are seeing a greater percentage than we would have anticipated of retirees returning into the workforce, and we're also seeing a greater percentage of people who are, for example, in education working part-time. So a little bit of all of the above. Okay, one more.
So you're talking about all the people who have come into Christchurch and they want to stay, but the whole rebuild will decrease over time. Do they have a willingness to change industries, and do we have the infrastructure to actually do that retraining into different industries? Excellent question.
So some of the workforce, the construction workforce, will leave. So if we've got, however many thousand people that have moved in here for the rebuild, we won't be able to keep all of them. Some of them will choose to stay in construction, and we'll go to Auckland, we'll go to Sydney, we'll go to Melbourne, to Singapore. And that's okay. We should be all right with that. Some of them will want to stay, and the question of cross-training is a really key one. So it depends on what their skills are, it depends on what their capabilities are. There are very good institutional cross-training education programs across the various different institutions in the region. So some of the employers, not the construction employers, but the underlying sector employers, have an opportunity to tap into that workforce, and they will need to engage with the tertiary institutions to be able to do that. There will be a program of work needed to make that possible. Okay, look, guys, I think we'll wrap that up. I'm getting the whole sorry. Stay for breakfast and a coffee and a yak. I hope you enjoyed it.